Welcome, dear listener. I am Dr. John H. Watson. Tonight, I find myself looking back upon a singular case that began not with a scream in the dark, but with the silent, damning evidence of a solitary flame. Before I recount the curious matter of the candle that cast two shadows, I must ask you to make yourself known to me as we sit together. From which city are you listening to our broadcast tonight? And among the many chronicles I have shared over the years, what is your favourite Sherlock Holmes story? You may ponder these questions as you settle into your armchair, perhaps listening through Spotify, while the dense London fog rolls over the cobblestones outside and we step firmly back into the gaslit rooms of Baker Street. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, and a heavy, suffocating fog had descended upon the capital. The yellow glare of the street lamps below our windows struggled to pierce the gloom, and the muffled clatter of an occasional hansom cab was the only evidence that life continued to move through the miserable damp. Inside our sitting room, however, the coal fire burned with a fierce and cheerful intensity, casting dancing shadows against the flocked wallpaper. I was seated at my desk, enveloped in the sharp, clean scent of carbolic acid, entirely absorbed in the methodical task of sorting and polishing my medical instruments. The rhythmic clink of surgical steel against the wooden tray provided a quiet, grounding counterpoint to the hissing of the fire. I had laid out my bistouries, my silver probes and my forceps, inspecting each with the precise eye of an army surgeon who knows that rust is as deadly as any visible poison. Sherlock Holmes was draped across the sofa opposite the hearth, his long limbs folded in that peculiar angular fashion of his. He had not spoken a word for 3 hours, his eyes half closed, a cold pipe resting loosely between his fingers. The silence between us was an old and comfortable companion, built upon years of shared peril and mutual respect. The tranquillity of our chambers was shattered abruptly. There was no polite ring of the street bell, no measured tread of our landlady upon the stairs to announce a visitor. Instead, the heavy street door slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass in our windows, followed immediately by the chaotic stumbling sound of frantic footsteps rushing up the staircase. I had scarcely the time to set down my scalpel and rise from my chair before the door to our sitting room was thrown violently open. A young woman stood upon the threshold, clutching the doorframe as though she might collapse if she let go. My medical training immediately assessed her condition. Her face was ashen, drained entirely of colour save for the dark, bruised circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sudden and profound trauma. Her breathing was shallow and painfully rapid, the erratic rhythm of a heart pushed to the absolute limits of endurance. She wore a heavy travelling dress of deep navy wool, though the hem was soaked with street mud and the collar was unbuttoned in a careless manner entirely unsuited to a woman of obvious wealth and breeding. A fine tremor shook her gloved hands, violently enough that the clasp of her reticule rattled against its chain. I moved forward at once, taking her firmly by the elbow and guiding her toward the basket chair near the fire. She offered no resistance, sinking into the cushions with a heavy, uncoordinated collapse. I poured a measure of brandy from the glass decanter on the sideboard and pressed the rim to her cold lips. She swallowed obediently, choking slightly on the harsh liquor, but a faint trace of colour returned to her cheeks. Holmes had not moved from the sofa, but his eyes were now wide open, sharp and glittering in the firelight. He took in every inch of our visitor without altering his posture by a fraction. When the woman finally spoke, her voice was hoarse and fractured. She announced herself as Lady Beatrice Pendleton. She had ridden the train from Hampshire, staring blindly at the passing countryside for 3 hours, driven entirely by a desperate refusal to accept the conclusion reached by the local authorities. Her brother, Lord Arthur Pendleton, was dead. He had been found that very morning in the locked study of their ancestral home, a heavy army revolver clutched in his stiffening hand, a terrible wound to his temple. The county police, led by a well-meaning but unimaginative inspector, had immediately declared the tragedy a suicide. The door was bolted from the inside, the windows were latched, and Arthur had been suffering from melancholy following the collapse of a substantial financial venture. The narrative was neat, plausible, and utterly devastating. Yet, as Lady Beatrice leaned forward, her hands twisting the dark fabric of her skirt, she vehemently rejected the inspector's verdict. Arthur was a coward when it came to physical pain, she insisted. He was terrified of firearms and had never fired a weapon in his life. More than that, she had seen him the night before, and he had spoken animatedly of a new prospect, a secret meeting he had arranged that would reverse their fortunes. He was not a man saying goodbye to the world, he was a man preparing for a fight. I listened with profound sympathy. As a doctor, I have seen grief twist the minds of the bereaved, forcing them to construct elaborate fantasies rather than accept the brutal reality of a self-inflicted end. Denial is a powerful anesthetic. I glanced at Holmes, expecting him to dismiss the matter with a gentle but firm refusal, for there seemed to be no mystery here to engage his formidable intellect. Holmes rose slowly from the sofa, leaving his unlit pipe on the mantelpiece. He approached Lady Beatrice, his face devoid of the sympathetic pity I had offered, replaced instead by the cold, calculating intensity of a hound catching a scent. He did not look at her face. His eyes were fixed upon the sleeve of her heavy wool dress. He asked her to describe the exact sequence of events when she discovered the body. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, a sharp instrument cutting through her distress. Lady Beatrice closed her eyes, trembling anew as she returned to the nightmare of the morning. She explained that she had awoken early, finding the house strangely silent. The gas lines in the manor had failed during the night, a common enough occurrence in the aging house, leaving the corridors shrouded in the gloom of the early winter dawn. She had taken a brass candlestick from the hallway table, lighting the single white tallow candle to guide her way down to Arthur's study. Finding the door locked and receiving no answer to her frantic knocking, she had summoned the groundskeeper, who forced the heavy oak door from its hinges. She described the smell of the room first, the stale metallic odor of dried blood mingling with the sharp, acrid stench of spent gunpowder. Her candle had illuminated the horrific scene. Arthur slumped over his mahogany desk, the revolver resting loosely in his palm. She had rushed to his side, dropping the candlestick onto the Persian rug in her panic, kneeling in the darkness beside her brother, weeping into the fabric of his coat until the servants physically pulled her away. Holmes listened in absolute silence. He stepped closer, leaning over her left shoulder. With a swift, almost imperceptible movement, his long white fingers reached out and lightly touched the fabric of her left sleeve, just above the cuff. I stepped forward to observe. There, crusted into the navy wool, was a thick, irregular smudge of wax. It was a detail I had entirely overlooked in my concern for her vital signs. Holmes straightened his back, clasping his hands behind him. He asked Lady Beatrice what kind of candle she had carried. She repeated, confused by the mundane question, that it was a simple white tallow candle from the hall. Holmes then asked if there were any other candles burning in the study when she entered. She swore there were none. The study was pitch black until the groundskeeper broke the door, and the heavy velvet curtains had been drawn shut against the morning light. Holmes paced to the window, looking out into the swirling London fog for a long, heavy moment before turning back to face us. His posture had completely transformed. The lethargy of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a vibrating, coiled energy. He instructed Lady Beatrice to stand and to look closely at the wax upon her own sleeve. She looked down, her brow furrowing in confusion. The wax embedded in her wool sleeve was not the pale, greasy smear of common white tallow. It was an unmistakable deep crimson. Furthermore, the shape of the splash was peculiar. It had not dripped downward from a candle held in her own hand. It had struck her sleeve from above and behind, pooling in a thick droplet before cooling instantly against the damp fabric. I felt a sudden chill run down my spine as the implications of the physical evidence collided with the narrative of a locked-room suicide. I looked at the red wax, then at Holmes, whose eyes were burning with the fierce light of the hunt. Holmes delivered his conclusion with the quiet, devastating precision of an executioner. He stated that it was a profound tragedy for the assassin that he chose to use a dyed beeswax taper, likely pilfered from a nearby Catholic chapel, to light his grim work. Holmes informed Lady Beatrice that her brother absolutely did not take his own life in the dark. The tragedy she witnessed was a meticulously staged theatre of murder, and the man who put the bullet into Lord Arthur Pendleton's skull was standing directly behind her, holding a bleeding red candle over her shoulder, in the very moment she knelt beside the dead man's body. Chapter 2. The wax on the floorboards. The air inside the study possessed the heavy, stagnant quality of a subterranean crypt. As the massive oak door swung inward, groaning in protest on neglected brass hinges, a sudden chill washed over the threshold. It carried with it the unmistakable scent of cold hearth ashes, stale pipe tobacco, and the faint, sweet metallic odor of blood. I stepped into the gloom, my medical bag gripped firmly in my right hand, while Holmes slipped past me with the silent predatory grace of a hound catching a fresh scent. The grand room was illuminated only by the pallid grey light of a London afternoon filtering through heavy velvet drapes. It was enough to reveal the master of the house, seated at his great mahogany desk, remarkably still. I approached the desk, my medical training taking immediate precedence over the morbid, oppressive atmosphere of the chamber. The victim was slumped awkwardly forward, his right cheek pressed flat against the polished wood, his left arm dangling loosely toward the fringed edge of a Persian rug. The posture lacked the natural collapse of a man who had merely fallen asleep at his work. I placed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, though the gesture was entirely perfunctory. The flesh was shockingly cold, possessing the rigid, unyielding texture of damp marble. Rigor mortis had firmly established itself in the jaw, the neck, and the upper extremities. I rolled up the stiffened sleeve of his dangling left arm. The skin was heavily mottled. I noted the deep, bluish-purple pooling of blood beneath the dermal layer, a clear indication of advanced post-mortem lividity. When I pressed my thumb firmly into the discoloured flesh, the skin did not blanch, telling me the blood had been settled in that position for quite some time. Based on the profound stiffness of the major joints and the frigid ambient temperature of the draughty room, I surmised that the man had been dead for no less than 10 hours, placing his violent demise somewhere in the bitter early hours of the morning. There was no obvious wound to be found. No heavy firearm lay discarded on the floorboards. No overturned glass smelling of bitter almonds or arsenic stood on the leather-bound blotting pad. His face, though entirely slack in death, showed none of the aggressive cyanosis or profound facial congestion that frequently accompanies chemical asphyxiation. I carefully checked the sclera of his eyes, searching for the tiny pinpricks of petechial hemorrhaging, indicative of strangulation or suffocation, but the whites were merely yellowed with age and completely clear. His breathing had simply ceased. I examined his mouth, noting his thin lips were slightly parted, his jaw clenched so tightly that the heavy muscles of his neck stood out like taut, rigid cords. His fingernails were perfectly intact, lacking the ragged, broken edges of a man who had physically fought for his life against an attacker. It was a silent, sudden death, but looking at the rigid terror frozen in his wide, staring eyes, I could not call it a peaceful one. I relayed my clinical findings to Holmes, keeping my voice low so as not to disturb the profound, heavy silence of the house. I informed him of the estimated time of death and the peculiar absence of any external trauma. I suggested that a sudden, catastrophic failing of the heart might account for the tragedy, perhaps brought on by a sudden, terrible shock. Holmes did not answer immediately. He was already prowling the perimeter of the room, his knees practically scraping the wooden skirting boards, his sharp eyes darting from the dark oak wainscoting to the heavy plaster cornices above. He moved with a deliberate, creeping slowness, pausing to examine the slightest scratch on the wood or the faintest flaking of plaster dust. He paused at the tall sash window, running a long, thin finger along the heavily rusted iron latch. The dust upon the deep sill lay in a thick, undisturbed blanket, resembling a layer of grey snow. A small spider had spun an intricate, undisturbed web across the lower right pane, catching the weak grey daylight in its silken threads. The web was perfectly intact, the tiny architect sitting dormant in the very centre. No entry had been made through the glass, no sash had been raised here in years. He moved to the great stone fireplace. He knelt, leaning his head and shoulders entirely into the black cavity, peering up the dark chimney shaft. He tapped the heavy iron register grate with his bare knuckles. The metal rang with a dull, solid thud, indicating it was firmly bolted to the internal masonry. He pointed to the thick layer of fine grey soot on the hearthstones, entirely unmarred by heavy boots or falling debris. The chimney, he observed in a low murmur, had been permanently sealed shut from the inside for months, likely to stop the harsh winter drafts. Finally, he returned to the door through which we had entered. It was a massive piece of architecture, built of solid, unyielding oak and fitted with a heavy brass lock. The large iron key still protruded from the keyhole on the inside of the room. A Scotland Yard inspector had been forced to smash a lower wooden panel to reach a hand through and manually turn the key to grant us access to the study. I watched closely as Holmes examined the splintered wood, the brass housing of the locking mechanism, and the exact resting position of the key. "The inspector told us this room was sealed from within," I said, observing Holmes as he crouched motionless by the door frame. "The windows are rusted shut, the chimney is impassable, the door was locked, and the key was found in the keyhole on the inside. It appears my theory of a failing heart is the only logical conclusion left to us. If it was murder, the murderer would still be in the room with us." Holmes stood suddenly, brushing the grey dust from the knees of his trousers. His eyes possessed that manic, glittering intensity that always accompanied a breakthrough in his deductions. "A failing heart does not explain the peculiar condition of the floorboards, Watson," he said. He gestured for me to join him near the centre of the room, halfway between the broken door and the mahogany desk. I knelt where he directed and peered closely at the wooden planks. The floor was mostly covered by the thick Persian rug, but a narrow strip of bare oak ran along the edge of the desk. Upon this exposed wood I saw a series of small, pale aberrations. They were droplets of wax. They formed a straight, deliberate line, spaced perhaps 6 inches apart, leading directly from the carved leg of the desk toward the heavy oak door. I touched one of the small droplets. It was completely hardened, possessing a slightly greasy texture that left a slick residue on my fingertip. "Someone carried a candle across the room," I suggested, inspecting the grease on my hand. The draught from the hallway caused the wax to spill over the edge. "Look closely at the shape of the droplets, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "They are perfectly round. If a man were walking while carrying a candle, the forward motion would cause the hot wax to strike the floor at an acute angle, creating an elongated splatter pointing in the direction of his travel. These drops fell straight down from a perfectly stationary source. Furthermore, the line ends precisely beneath the keyhole of the door." I frowned, trying to picture the sequence of events in the empty air. "But the only light source on the desk is a brass gas lamp," I noted. "The main chandelier above us is electric. There are no candles in this room." Holmes pivoted on his heel and strode back to the desk. He leaned over the lifeless body of the victim and reached toward the far corner of the mahogany surface, a dark spot previously obscured from my angle by a tall stack of leather ledger books. When he withdrew his hand, he held an object of singular, bizarre construction. It was a candle, but unlike any I had ever seen in a London shop. It was unusually thick, perhaps 4 inches in diameter, and cast from a pale, yellowish wax that smelled faintly of animal fat and raw pine resin. Most striking, however, was the fact that it possessed 2 distinct wicks, set exactly 1 inch apart in the flat upper surface. The wax around both wicks had melted during its use, forming a deep, unified pool in the center of the cylinder, which had since cooled and solidified into a hard depression. "This is not a household item," Holmes stated, holding the heavy candle up to the grey light of the window. "It was poured into a custom mould. The wax is a deliberate blend of tallow and beeswax, designed by a chemist to burn at a very specific, calculated temperature. But the true, terrifying genius lies in the dual wicks." "I do not understand the purpose of 2 wicks," I confessed, staring at the strange object. "Surely one is sufficient for reading or illumination." "It was not designed for illumination," Holmes said. "It was designed for tension." He reached into the deep pocket of his Inverness cape and produced his silver magnifying lens. He brought the glass close to the hardened pool of wax between the 2 burnt wicks. He stepped back and urged me to look through the glass. I leaned in, squinting through the curved magnification. Embedded in the hardened wax, stretching directly across the gap between the 2 blackened strings, was a faint, straight indentation. It was a narrow groove, no thicker than a single horsehair, impressed directly into the melted surface before it had entirely cooled. At the very edge of the wax pool, caught near the outer rim of the candle, I spotted a microscopic fragment of grey fibre. "A thread," I murmured, the chilling realization dawning slowly upon my mind. A thread was suspended between the wicks. "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. "A thread of grey silk, strong enough to bear a significant physical weight, yet thin enough to pass completely unnoticed through a standard brass keyhole." He set the heavy candle down on the blotting pad and moved back to the door, tracing the invisible line of the wax droplets in the empty air with his long hand. He spoke rapidly now, the syllables clipping together as his exceptional mind reconstructed the hidden architecture of the crime. "The murderer did not lock the door from the inside, Watson. He locked it from the hallway. He tied the grey silk thread to the circular bow of the heavy brass key. He passed the thread through the keyhole, drawing it slowly across the floorboards. He secured the opposite end of the taut thread to the twin wicks of the candle resting on the desk. He then lit the candle and left the room, pulling the door shut behind him. I stared at the heavy brass lock, struggling to comprehend the physics of the trick. But how could a simple silk thread turn a heavy iron key? The thread did not turn the key, Holmes corrected instantly. The murderer locked the door from the outside using a duplicate key or a set of professional picks. He then removed his tool. The thread, under constant tension from the hallway, was attached to the original key, which rested on the floorboards just inside the room. Once the door was externally secured, the murderer pulled the thread tightly. The key was drawn up the heavy wood of the door, guided perfectly by the tension, and pulled directly into the internal keyhole. The impenetrable illusion of the locked room was complete. "But the thread," I protested, gesturing to the door. "The thread would still be attached to the key." "It would be entirely visible to the inspector when the door was broken." Holmes pointed a long finger back to the custom candle resting on the desk. "That is the sole purpose of the dual wicks." The thread was suspended directly across the wax pool. As the twin flames burned downward, they aggressively melted the wax, creating a pool of boiling liquid tallow. When the fire finally reached the exact level of the horizontal silk thread, it incinerated the fibre in an instant. The tension snapped. The long segment of thread attached to the door was rapidly pulled back under the crack of the floorboards, or through the keyhole by the murderer waiting patiently in the hall. The small segment attached to the candle fell backward into the liquid wax, sinking to the bottom where it was entirely consumed, leaving only that microscopic grey fibre we just observed. I was astounded by the sheer mechanical ingenuity of the deadly mechanism. The murderer had constructed a flawless timed device out of simple string and wax, ensuring that by the time the victim was discovered, the room would appear perfectly, impossibly sealed from within. The drops on the floorboards were simply tears of melted wax that had travelled down the taut, vibrating thread before it snapped, solidifying permanently on the oak planks below. "It is a masterpiece of dark misdirection," I admitted, looking down at the pale droplets that mapped the killer's cunning. "A man who calculates the precise melting point of tallow merely to conceal his exit from a murder is a highly dangerous adversary indeed." Holmes stood entirely motionless by the splintered door. His silence was not born of satisfaction at unravelling the trick, but of a deep, troubled concentration. He looked past the heavy desk, past the rigid corpse of the man whose heart had so mysteriously ceased to beat, and stared blankly at the empty wall beyond. "He is dangerous, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual triumph. "But elaborate misdirection is only employed when there is something absolutely vital to hide. The mechanics of the door are merely a theatrical performance. They are designed by a very clever mind to force us to ask how the man was locked inside." He turned his sharp profile toward me, the weak grey light cutting deep, skull-like shadows beneath his cheekbones. "The true question, Watson, is not how the room was sealed. The true question is what the killer left inside this room that required such a desperate, elaborate guarantee that no human soul would enter until the dead man's blood was completely cold." Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Siblings. The air in Elias Vance's study was thick with the scent of leather bindings, sealing wax, and the distinct, sharp metallic odour of coagulating blood from the adjacent room. Holmes sat at the vast mahogany desk, his long back curved like a strung bow over a sea of scattered ledgers. He had been motionless for the better part of an hour. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic scrape of his thumbnail against his chin and the occasional dry rustle of parchment turning. I stood by the heavily draped window watching the damp morning fog press against the glass, obscuring the London streets in a wash of dirty grey. "You have found something in his accounts," I said at last, breaking the prolonged silence. Holmes did not look up. His eyes, sharp and predatory, darted across the columns of figures. He was bleeding, Watson, hemorrhaging quite severely. I stepped away from the window, instinctively glancing toward the parlour door where Vance's body lay. I examined him myself, Holmes. The wound was fatal, but the blood loss was largely contained to his immediate vicinity. Not blood, Watson. Capital. Holmes tapped a long, pale finger against the open ledger. "For the past 8 months, our late Mr. Vance has been liquidating his assets at an alarming rate. Properties in Mayfair sold at a fraction of their worth. substantial withdrawals from his accounts at Cox and Company. The money was converted into bearer bonds and vanished. Blackmail, I suggested, moving closer to examine the book. Holmes leaned back, pressing his fingertips together. The amounts are erratic. £10,000 in April, 200 in May, 15,000 merely 3 days ago. A blackmailer demands regular tribute, not the frantic irregular emptying of a lifelong fortune. No, Watson. Vance was preparing to flee, or he was purchasing something of astronomical value. I looked at the neat columns of numbers, noting the trembling hand that had penned the most recent entries. The ink was slightly smeared on the final withdrawal, as if the writer had been in a state of profound agitation. His pulse was racing when he wrote this, I observed. The downstrokes are erratic, heavy. A man operating under immense strain. Holmes offered a brief, satisfied nod. Exactly so. You have an eye for the physical manifestations of terror, Doctor. While I trace the destination of this vanished fortune, I suggest you employ that medical eye downstairs. The servants know more than they have told the constables. The official force asks what people saw. I want you to find out what they felt. I left Holmes to his mathematics and descended the narrow back staircase into the servants' quarters. The temperature dropped noticeably as I moved from the plush carpets of the upper floors to the bare stone of the scullery corridor. The air here smelled of damp wool, strong lye soap, and boiled cabbage. In the kitchen, the remnants of a disrupted household were evident. A copper kettle sat cold on the vast iron stove. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, sat at the scrubbed pine table. She was a woman in her late 50s with a posture so rigidly upright it suggested a lifetime of suppressing her own comforts. As I approached, I noted the faint bluish tint to her lips and the shallow, rapid rise of her chest. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white, the skin parchment thin over the joints. She was in a state of suppressed shock, her heart undoubtedly labouring under the strain of the morning's discoveries. Beside her stood Thomas, the young footman, who kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had the distinct pallor of a man who had not slept, his pupils dilated despite the brightness of the kitchen gaslight. "You must forgive the intrusion, Mrs. D.S." "Gable," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I am Dr. Watson. I wish to ask you a few questions, not as an officer of the law, but as a man attempting to understand the illness that has afflicted this house." She looked up at me, her gaze guarded. "The police have asked their questions, sir." "We know nothing of the murder." "I'm not asking about the murder," I replied, pulling a simple wooden chair out and sitting across from her, placing myself at her eye level to reduce any perceived intimidation. "I am asking about the days before. A man does not empty his bank accounts without a change in his demeanour." Mr. Vance was troubled. Thomas the footman let out a short, bitter breath. "Troubled is a mild word for it, sir. He was seeing ghosts." Thomas, the housekeeper, snapped, though her voice lacked force. "Let him speak, Mrs. Gable," I said gently. The tension in the young man's jaw told me he was desperate to unburden himself. The footman wiped his palms on his trousers. "It started a fortnight ago. The master gave orders that no one was to be admitted. He changed the locks on the front door himself. Sweating he was while he worked the screwdriver. I offered to help, but he cursed me and sent me away. He started walking the halls at night. You could hear him pacing, dragging his left foot a bit, the way he did when his gout flared up." "And did he have visitors?" I asked. "None that came through the door," Mrs. Gable said quietly, her hands unclasped, revealing a damp handkerchief she had been twisting into a tight knot. "But there were voices. 2 nights ago I went up to turn down the lamps. I heard him shouting in the study. Who was he shouting at?" "His brother, sir." I sat back, surprised. The police reports, as well as the initial statements given to Scotland Yard, had indicated Elias Vance was an only child, a solitary bachelor with no living relatives. "You are certain?" I asked. Mrs. Gable offered a grim, humourless smile. "I have served this family for 40 years, Dr. Watson. I knew Arthur Vance as well as I knew Elias. They were twins. But Arthur was the dark one, not in colouring, you understand, but in spirit. He was cast out of the family when they were barely 20. A matter of a forged draft and a stolen horse. Their father disowned him. We were forbidden to speak his name. When the old man died, Elias inherited everything. And Arthur returned, I surmised, noting the way Mrs. Gable's breathing quickened at the mention of the name. "I did not see him," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. But I know the sound of their arguing. They had a specific way of tearing at each other, vicious, low words. I heard Elias yell that he would not give it up, that it was his by right of blood. And then I heard the other voice. It was Arthur. It had to be. He laughed. It was a terrible sound, cold as grave dirt. He told Elias that the shadow always catches up to the candle. I committed the strange phrase to memory. You are sure it was Arthur, even after all these years? The footman leaned forward. He was here, Dr. Watson. Yesterday morning I found the side gate unlocked, and in the mud by the garden path there were boot prints, deep ones, but strange. They didn't match. The left boot dug deep into the soil, but the right one barely made a mark, like the man was dragging his right leg. A mirror image, I thought quietly. Elias Vance dragged his left foot due to gout. His twin brother walked with a pronounced limp on the right. Did anything else unusual occur? I asked, turning my attention back to the housekeeper. You said Elias shouted that he would not give something up. What was he referring to? Mrs. Gable looked around the kitchen as if afraid the walls might betray her. The master's collection, she whispered. He kept it in the small safe behind the portrait in the library. He checked it every morning. This morning, before the police arrived, before I even knew he was dead, I went to dust the library. The portrait was swung open. The safe was unlocked. I leaned forward. What was kept in the safe, Mrs. Gable? She swallowed hard, her throat visibly working. The heavy silver, the estate deeds. But those were still there. Only one thing was missing. The silver casket that held the Vance inheritance, a solid black opal, large as a robin's egg. They called it the Serpent's Eye. It belonged to their mother. Arthur always claimed it was promised to him. I thanked the staff for their time, my mind racing with the implications of this new evidence, and quickly made my way back up the narrow stairs. The sibling rivalry, the missing jewel, the sudden liquidation of assets. The pieces were swirling in a chaotic cloud, waiting for the precise gravity of Holmes's intellect to pull them into order. I found Holmes exactly where I had left him, though he had discarded the ledgers and was now examining a small piece of charred wax through his magnifying glass. I have the story, Holmes, I said, closing the door firmly behind me. A twin brother, cast out and presumed gone, returned to claim a birthright. A bitter dispute over a family heirloom, an opal of immense value missing from the library safe. The servants heard them arguing, and the footman found tracks indicating the brother's distinct limp. It gives us both motive and a suspect. Holmes lowered his glass and turned his sharp grey eyes toward me. He remained perfectly still for a long moment, absorbing the information without interrupting. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. A twin brother, he repeated. With a limp on the right leg. Yes, I said, feeling a surge of satisfaction at having secured such vital intelligence. And he took the opal. Holmes stood up, discarding the magnifying glass onto the desk. He walked toward the parlour door, the room where the body of Elias Vance still lay. I followed him, confused by his sudden, intense agitation. He stood in the doorway staring down at the corpse. The dead man's face was frozen in a mask of ultimate terror, his left leg twisted at an awkward angle beneath him. You have done excellent work, Watson, Holmes said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual triumph. You have indeed found the missing piece of the puzzle. But it does not complete the picture you believe it does. I stood beside him, looking down at the deceased. I do not understand, Holmes. Arthur Vance returned, demanded the jewel, and when Elias refused, he killed him and took it. The tracks in the garden prove he was here. Holmes knelt beside the body, his long fingers hovering just inches from the dead man's right boot. Look closely at the soles of the deceased's footwear, Watson. What do you see? I leaned in, applying my medical training to the observation. The sole of the left boot is heavily worn on the inside edge, consistent with the dragging motion caused by severe gout. The right boot is relatively pristine. Exactly, Holmes said, standing up and retreating a step, as if the body itself had suddenly become offensive to him. Elias Vance dragged his left leg. Arthur Vance, according to your excellent witness, dragged his right. Yes, I said, still failing to see his point. Holmes turned to me, his face pale and drawn tight. The footprints in the garden were made by a man dragging his right leg, Watson. But the blood spatter on the carpet in the hallway, the pattern I examined before you went downstairs, tells a very different story. The man who walked away from the murder scene, the man who left bloody footprints leading to the library where the safe was opened, was dragging his left leg. A cold knot formed in my stomach as the implication of his words took hold. Holmes looked back at the corpse, his eyes dark with a sudden, terrible understanding. "The question, Watson, is not where Arthur Vance has gone with the jewel. The question is who, exactly, is lying dead on this floor." Chapter 4. The Man with the Crooked. Came the journey from the estate back into the dense labyrinth of London took the better part of an hour. The cab smelled of old leather and damp wool, a scent that clung to the heavy coats we wore against the biting chill of the April morning. Holmes sat opposite me, his chin resting upon his steepled fingers, his eyes tracking the dull yellow halos of the gas lamps as they broke through the thick fog. He had spoken scarcely a word since we left the grounds, his mind evidently chewing on the peculiar absence of a second weapon and the strange geometry of the shadows cast upon the drawing-room wall. I respected his silence, turning my own thoughts to the name the groundsman had stammered out under Holmes's relentless questioning. Elias Thorne. It was a name not entirely unfamiliar to me. During my brief tenure consulting at the casualty ward of St. Semidit, Thomas's hospital, I had treated a Dockland enforcer whose jaw had been splintered in 3 places. When I asked the poor wretch who had delivered such a savage beating, he had merely spat a tooth into the basin and whispered the name Thorne. He was a man of notorious temper, a rival in the dead man's shipping enterprises, and according to the panicked groundsman, he had been seen fleeing through the yew maze on the night of the murder, a distinctive crooked cane clutched in his fist. Our hansom halted before a dilapidated boarding house in the shadow of the Southwark docks. The air here was profoundly different from the manicured lawns of the estate. It was thick with the scent of low tide, rotting timber, and the acrid bite of burning coal. Holmes tossed a silver coin to the driver and stepped down onto the slick cobblestones. He did not look up at the peeling paint of the facade or the cracked, grime-covered windows. His attention was entirely fixed upon the mud leading up to the stone threshold. He knelt, completely disregarding the damp seeping into his trousers, and traced a deep, uneven indentation in the muck. It was a circular depression, pressed heavily on the right side, accompanied by a dragging scuff mark. "The cane," he murmured, standing up and brushing his knees with a gloved hand. "Carved ash, I should think, bearing the weight of a man exceeding 14 stone. Notice the depth of the right-sided step, Watson. The man heavily favours his left leg, leaning upon the wood to compensate. A recent injury, or a poorly set bone. A fracture of the femur or the patella would account for the dragging toe, I observed, studying the striations in the mud. If he ran through that maze in the dark, he likely suffered a severe dislocation. We ascended the stairs, the rotted floorboards groaning in protest under our boots. Holmes did not knock at the door at the end of the landing. He turned the brass handle and pushed the door inward without hesitation. The room was suffocatingly hot, heated by a small cast-iron stove glowing a sullen red in the far corner. The air hung heavy with a nauseating smell of stale tobacco and boiled cabbage. Sitting beside the stove, hunched over a tin cup, was Elias Thorne. He was a massive creature, built like a draught horse, with shoulders that seemed too broad for the narrow wooden chair beneath him. As we entered, his head snapped up. I observed him immediately with a medical eye. His skin was unnervingly pallid beneath a layer of soot and sweat. A faint, uncontrollable tremor rattled the tin cup against his saucer. The pupils of his eyes were dilated, suggesting either a recent severe shock or the sustained use of laudanum to manage pain. Most telling was his posture. His left leg was extended stiffly toward the stove, the rough fabric of his trousers pulled taut over a knee that bulged with unnatural, fluid-filled swelling. Resting against the arm of his chair, precisely within reach of his right hand, was a thick walking stick of dark ash, its handle twisted into a grotesque, crooked burl. Thorne made to rise, his massive, calloused hand closing over the crooked handle of the cane. A sudden spasm of agony crossed his heavy features, and he sank back with a heavy exhalation. His breath rattled in his chest, shallow and rapid. "You are Elias Thorne," Holmes stated, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him with a decisive click. The man glared at us, his jaw setting into a hard, combative line. "Who is asking?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. You will find that lying to me requires an intellect you do not possess, and fleeing from me requires 2 sound legs, which you evidently lack." Thorn released his grip on the cane and let his hand drop to his swollen knee. He breathed heavily through his nose. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Holmes. I have done nothing to warrant a visit from the police, let alone the man who does their thinking for them." Holmes walked slowly to the small window, wiping a patch of grime away with his thumb to look out at the grey, churning water of the Thames. "You have a violent history, Mr. Thorn. You have publicly threatened the deceased on no less than 3 occasions over shipping routes in the East Indies. And 2 nights ago you were seen running through the yew maze of his estate moments after a brutal murder had been committed." Thorn remained silent, but I saw the thick cords of muscle in his neck tighten. His gaze shifted involuntarily to the bottom of his cane. Holmes turned from the window. He approached the chair and pointed a long, pale finger at the ferrule of the walking stick. "You did not clean it properly. There is a specific yellow clay native to the riverbanks of the estate, mixed with fragments of crushed yew berries. It is still packed deeply into the crevices of the wood. Furthermore, the exact indentation of your stick was found precisely beneath the library window. You stood there for some time. The depth of the impression indicates you were not merely passing by, you were waiting." Thorn swallowed hard. The aggressive tremor in his hand vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrified stillness. It was a reaction I had seen in soldiers right before the artillery shells began to fall. "I was there," Thorn admitted, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "But I did not kill him. I went to collect a debt. He owed me money, Holmes. Money he stole from our joint ventures. I meant to take it from his safe." "You intended burglary," Holmes said flatly. "Yes, I brought a crowbar tucked into my heavy coat. I stood beneath the window, in the mud, waiting for the gaslight in his study to be extinguished. But it never went out." Holmes took a step closer, his sharp eyes fixed intensely upon Thorn's pale face. "What did you see?" The large man shuddered. It was an involuntary reaction, a genuine physical manifestation of dread that I could never mistake for a theatrical performance. The brute was profoundly, deeply frightened. "The heavy curtains were drawn," Thorn said, his voice dropping to a harsh, rasping whisper. "But the light from the candles inside cast shadows against the thin fabric. I saw him, the dead man. He was sitting at his desk. I could tell by the shape of his head, the way he always slouched over his ledgers when he was counting his coin." Thorn paused, wetting his dry lips with his tongue. He looked past Holmes, staring at the blank wall as if reliving the nightmare. "And then I saw the other one." "The other one," Holmes repeated softly. "The murderer." Thorn nodded slowly. "But it made no sense, Mr. Holmes. The shadow of the second man simply appeared. It did not walk into the room. It did not step from behind the curtains or open the door. One moment the dead man was alone, and the next a towering silhouette was standing directly behind his chair. I saw its arm raise. I saw the strike. The dead man slumped forward onto his desk, and the flame of the candle flickered. Holmes stood perfectly still, his face an impenetrable mask of concentration. "And then what did you do?" "I ran," Thorn said, his voice breaking slightly. "I knew how it would look. A rival, a man with my violent reputation, found lurking outside the house while he bled to death inside. I turned and ran toward the maze. I fell in the dark, twisted my knee on an exposed root, and dragged myself the rest of the way to the main road. I paid a passing cart driver to bring me back to Southwark. I have not left this room since. I did not kill him. I swear it on my mother's grave." Holmes said nothing for a long minute. He reached out and lifted the crooked cane from the arm of the chair. Thorn flinched but did not attempt to stop him. Holmes brought the heavy wood close to his face, examining the smooth handle, the varnished shaft, and finally the muddied tip. He produced a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and studied the dried yellow clay. I watched my friend closely. His eyes darted back and forth across the wood, his brow furrowed. He rubbed a flake of the clay between his thumb and forefinger, bringing it to his nose to scent the earth. Then he examined the top of the handle. The wood here was smooth, polished by years of friction from Thorn's heavy palm. But there was something else. Holmes tilted the handle toward the dull light filtering through the grimy window. A dark, rust-coloured smear was trapped deep in the grooves of the carved burl. As a physician, I needed no magnifying glass to identify the substance. It was dried blood. I stepped forward, my eyes meeting Holmes's over the length of the cane. The implications were immediate and damning. Thorne claimed he had merely watched from outside, that he had never entered the house, never approached the victim. Yet his walking stick bore the unmistakable stain of a violent encounter. Thorne saw the direction of our gaze. He looked at the handle of the cane, and his pale face drained of what little colour remained. He pushed himself back against the wooden chair, his heavy chest heaving. "That is not what you think," he stammered, the fear returning to his eyes. "I cut my hand." When I slipped in the maze, I tore my palm on a broken yew branch. "Look." He held up his right hand. Across the thick, calloused palm was a jagged laceration, angry and red, the edges sealed with a crust of dried blood. The wound was entirely consistent with his story, yet the coincidence of it was almost too perfect. Holmes handed the cane back to Thorne. He did not ask to examine the wounded hand, he did not accuse the man of lying, he merely adjusted his cuffs and turned toward the door. "We will leave you to your recovery, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said quietly. "Do not attempt to leave London. Your knee will not permit it, and my associates at Scotland Yard will certainly not allow it." We descended the groaning stairs and stepped back out into the freezing fog of the Docklands. The damp, foul air felt suddenly clean compared to the oppressive, fearful heat of Thorne's room. I looked at Holmes, expecting him to declare the case solved. The man had motive, he had a history of violence, and his cane was stained with blood. He placed himself at the scene of the crime. "Surely," I said, as we waited on the corner for another cab to pass, "Thorne's story of the shadow appearing from thin air is the desperate fabrication of a guilty mind. He struck the man down, fled, and injured himself in his panic." Holmes stared out at the dark, churning water of the Thames, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his ulster. His expression was not one of triumph, but of profound, chilling unease. "You missed the most vital detail of his tale, Watson," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the river slapping against the docks. "The clay on the cane proves Thorne was standing in the soft mud beneath the window. But when we examined that very mud this morning, there were no footprints leading away from the window toward the maze. The heavy, dragging steps of a 14-stone man with a twisted knee only appeared halfway across the lawn." Holmes turned to look at me, his grey eyes piercing through the gloom. "He did not run from the window, Watson. He was carried. And we are now left to ask what manner of creature possesses the immense strength to carry a man of Thorne's bulk away from the house, entirely against his will, without leaving a single trace of its own passage." Chapter 5. The Chiming of the Midnight Clock. The fire had sunk to a dull red glow in the grate of our Baker Street sitting room. The heavy London fog pressed against the window panes like a damp woolen shroud, muffling the clatter of the occasional passing hansom cab and isolating us from the sprawling, restless city beyond. It was 1:15. For the better part of 3 hours, Sherlock Holmes had remained curled in his armchair, his knees drawn up to his chin, a cold briar pipe clamped firmly between his teeth. His eyes, fixed unblinking upon the dying embers, held the sharp, glassy concentration of a hunting falcon. As a medical man, I noted the shallow, measured rhythm of his breathing, the slight rigidity in his neck, and the unnatural stillness of his hands. He was a man holding an immense internal tension, waiting for a very specific stimulus to release it. On the table between us sat the peculiar carriage clock we had retrieved that afternoon from the late Elias Pendleton's study. It was a heavy, ornate piece of brass and enamel work, intricately engraved with floral motifs and geometric patterns. It looked entirely out of place among the stark, utilitarian furnishings of the deceased clerk's rooms. Pendleton had been a man of meagre habits and threadbare coats, a man who measured out his coal by the lump, yet this clock spoke of considerable, almost ostentatious expense. Holmes had carried it back to our quarters with the utmost care, placing it upon the polished mahogany surface as though it were a highly volatile explosive. I watched the minute hand tick steadily toward the hour. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic metallic heartbeat of the timepiece. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking slightly under my weight. The air in the room had grown heavy, thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the faint, acrid smell of coal smoke drifting down the chimney. I found my own pulse quickening in strange sympathy with the ticking mechanism, though I could not deduce what precise event my friend anticipated. Holmes did not turn his head. He merely raised a single, long finger to call for silence. I held my breath. With a sudden, sharp whir of internal gears, the clock began to strike. The first chime rang out into the quiet room, a deep, resonant note that vibrated visibly against the glass of the windows. Holmes lowered his knees and placed his feet flat upon the hearthrug. The second chime sounded. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the brass face of the clock. At the third and fourth strokes, I observed the intricate workings through the glass side panels. The heavy brass pendulum swung with a relentless, hypnotic cadence, catching the low firelight and casting long, sweeping shadows across the walls. By the eighth stroke, Holmes rose from his chair with a fluid, sudden grace that completely belied his hours of rigid immobility. He stepped to the table and rested his long, pale hands gently upon the edges of the clock. The 11th chime faded. The 12th struck with absolute finality. As the last echo dissolved into the damp air, Holmes pressed his thumbs firmly against the twin enamelled pillars flanking the clock face. There was a sharp click, a sound distinctly separate from the ticking mechanism, followed by the faint scrape of metal upon metal. The heavy base of the clock, which I had assumed to be a solid block of brass, slid forward exactly half an inch. Holmes exhaled slowly, a thin plume of breath visible in the chilly room. He pulled the base free, revealing it to be a shallow, felt-lined drawer cleverly integrated into the plinth. Within the hidden compartment lay a single, folded sheet of thick vellum paper, sealed with a cracked drop of dark red wax. "The missing correspondence," Holmes said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The space left empty in Pendleton's desk was entirely the wrong dimension for a standard ledger. It was shaped for a secret, Watson, and here is the secret he guarded with his life. I moved to his side, leaning over the table to examine the document. The wax bore no official crest, only the deep, uneven impression of a thumbprint, smeared in obvious haste. The paper itself was of high quality, rigid and slightly yellowed at the edges. It smelled faintly of damp earth and lavender water, a curious combination that immediately registered in my mind as out of the ordinary. Holmes broke the seal. The paper crackled sharply in the quiet room as he unfolded it. I watched his eyes dart rapidly back and forth across the script. The sharp, aquiline angles of his face softened into a look of profound, albeit temporary, astonishment. He read the missive twice, his brow furrowing deeper with each pass, before handing it across the table to me. "Read it aloud, Watson," he commanded, gesturing with his pipe. "Let us hear how completely we have misjudged the landscape of this sordid little tragedy." I took the letter. The handwriting was a chaotic, trembling scrawl, the ink heavily blotted in several places where the pen had lingered too long upon the page. It was the penmanship of a man writing in a state of severe agitation or consuming terror. "My dear Pendleton," I read, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of our rooms. "I enclose the final sum. It exhausts my current liquid reserves, but it must be done. Do not attempt to contact them again. They possess no mercy and no honour. If the photograph is not returned to you at the rendezvous in St. Jude's churchyard, you must flee the country immediately. I cannot protect you further without exposing my own family to the ruin they promise. Burn this upon receipt. Your desperate friend, Arthur Thorne." I lowered the paper. The words seemed to hang in the damp air, fundamentally altering the entire foundation of our investigation. I looked at Holmes, who had returned to his armchair and was now methodically packing his pipe with coarse shag tobacco from the toe of his Persian slipper. "Thorne," I murmured, struggling to align this new evidence with our previous deductions. We were entirely convinced Arthur Thorne was the orchestrator of Pendleton's ruin. The violent argument the landlady overheard, the threatening posture, the significant financial discrepancies in Thorne's own accounts. All of it pointed perfectly to Thorne demanding extortion payments from the clerk. Holmes struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the sharp contour of his nose and casting deep cavernous shadows beneath his cheekbones. "Look at the negative space, Watson," Holmes said, shaking the match out and tossing it into the grate. "We saw a heated argument. We assumed a threat. We saw money missing from Pendleton's ledgers and matching withdrawals from Thorne's bank. We assumed extortion. But the letter repaints the canvas entirely. Thorne was not bleeding Pendleton dry. He was bleeding himself dry to save Pendleton. The argument the landlady overheard was not one of malice, but of desperate protective frustration. Thorne was begging his friend to run. But why the intense secrecy? I asked, studying the frantic slope of the handwriting once more. If Thorn was acting as a benefactor, why did he not go to the Scotland Yard inspectors? Why hide his charity like a shameful crime? Because the blackmailer's reach extends far beyond a simple demand for coin, Holmes replied. He blew a dense grey cloud of smoke toward the ceiling, watching it curl and dissipate. The letter speaks of a photograph of such devastating consequence that a highly respectable, fabulously wealthy man like Arthur Thorne would bankrupt his own private reserves to ensure its destruction and further risk his family's unblemished reputation to keep his involvement entirely hidden. I considered the implications, my mind turning over the medical and psychological nature of blackmail. It is a soul-destroying crime, a slow poison that degrades the victim day by day until nothing remains but raw fear. The victim in this case was a quiet, unassuming clerk who rarely left his modest lodgings. What possible transgression could a man of Pendleton's invisible stature have committed to warrant such a vicious, carefully orchestrated extortion scheme? He was a conduit, Watson. Holmes leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice dropping to a low, tight register. Pendleton was merely the weak link in a much larger, far heavier chain. The blackmailer did not care a whit about the clerk. The blackmailer used the clerk to exert leverage over Thorne. And Thorne, driven by some agonizing sense of loyalty, or perhaps a shared unspoken guilt, paid the ransom until he could pay absolutely no more. I looked down at the empty drawer in the base of the ornate clock. And when the money finally stopped, the blackmailer struck. Precisely. But they did not strike at the wealthy Thorne. They struck at the impoverished Pendleton. Why? To punish Thorne, I suggested, relying on my understanding of criminal cruelty. To demonstrate their ruthless intent and force him to find more funds. Holmes shook his head slowly. A blackmailer is a parasite, my dear doctor. A parasite does not slaughter the host's favourite companions simply to make a dramatic point. They do it to maintain total control. Pendleton had stopped paying because Thorne had run out of liquid funds, but Pendleton still held one highly dangerous piece of information. The rendezvous at St. Jude's churchyard. Pendleton knew who physically collected the money. The murderer is the blackmailer, I said, the grim reality settling heavily over my shoulders. They killed him to sever the only physical link back to their true identity. A perfectly logical deduction, but an incomplete one. Holmes stood and began to pace the length of the room, his movements restless, driven by the furious, invisible machinery of his mind. The letter tells us Thorne sent the final sum. It tells us Pendleton was instructed to exchange that money for the photograph at St. Jude's. But Pendleton was found dead in his own study, his throat crushed, his pockets completely empty. The clock was left untouched on the mantel. The secret compartment remained undiscovered by the killer. Because the killer was searching for the photograph, I reasoned, following his logic. Or the money. Holmes stopped at the window, peering out into the swirling yellow fog that blanketed Baker Street. But consider the strict timeline of events. The letter arrived 2 days before the murder. Thorne provided the heavy sum of cash. Pendleton hid the letter in the clock, but took the money. He went to the churchyard. How can you be mathematically certain he went? Look closely in your memory at the hem of the trousers we examined at the mortuary this morning. The mud caked upon the fabric was a distinct chalky clay mixed with granular, crushed limestone. It is exactly the unique soil composition of the recent grave excavations at the northern edge of St. Trafe. Jude's. Pendleton went to the midnight meeting. Then he made the exchange, I said, feeling a surge of hope. He gave them the money and successfully took the photograph. Holmes turned from the window. His eyes were dark, entirely devoid of their usual victorious spark. If he made the exchange, Watson, why was the photograph not found upon his body? Why was it not hidden here, within his most prized possession? Why did the killer pursue him all the way back to his rooms, strangle the life from him, and tear the study apart in a frenzied, destructive search? I felt a sudden, cold prickle of deep unease at the base of my neck, because the exchange never happened. No, Watson. The exchange happened. Pendleton gave up the money, but the blackmailer, operating with customary treachery, did not surrender the photograph. And Pendleton, a quiet, frightened little man pushed beyond the absolute limits of human endurance, finally did something entirely unexpected. He fought back. He took something from the blackmailer. something far more dangerous to the criminal than a mere photograph. What could a frail, terrified clerk possibly take from a ruthless, seasoned extortionist? Holmes walked slowly back to the table and picked up the heavy brass clock. He turned it over, bringing it close to the ambient light, examining the smooth underside of the hidden drawer. With his sharp thumbnail, he scraped away a tiny, almost invisible flake of dried, dark substance adhering to the polished wood. "He took their blood," Holmes said quietly, rolling the dark flake between his fingers, "and he left us a trail to follow straight into the very heart of the dark." Chapter 6. The Burned Ledger. The fog had rolled in off the Thames with the turning of the tide, a thick yellow vapour that clung to the brickwork of the city and reduced the gas lamps to sickly, isolated halos. We had left the hansom cab somewhere near King William Street, the driver flatly refusing to navigate the treacherous decline into the labyrinth of alleys flanking the river. Holmes walked half a pace ahead of me, his ulster collar turned up against the penetrating damp. His silence was absolute. I had learned over our years of association that such silence was not an absence of thought, but rather a concentration so dense it left no room for idle speech. I kept my hand deep in the pocket of my overcoat, my fingers resting against the cold metal of my service revolver. The missive we had intercepted hours earlier at Baker Street demanded a rendezvous in the heart of the Billingsgate wards, a place where a gentleman might easily lose his purse and a careless investigator his life. The air here tasted of salt, decaying fish scales, and the acrid smoke of coal fires struggling against the suffocating mist. We passed the darkened silhouettes of warehouses and narrow entries that seemed to swallow the fog itself. I noted the unsteady gait of a late-night wanderer retreating from our path, the telltale tremor of gin palsy in his shoulders as he melted into a doorway. Yet Holmes did not spare the man a glance. His attention was tethered to a string of logic I could only guess at, pulling us deeper into a narrow passage entirely cut off from the main thoroughfare. The cobblestones beneath our boots gave way to packed earth and discarded refuse, silencing our footfalls as we approached a derelict counting house squeezed between two hulking brick depositories. There was no light in the single window. The door, swollen with moisture and age, hung slightly askew on rusted iron hinges. Holmes paused. He did not touch the wood immediately. Instead, he knelt, bringing his face mere inches from the lower jamb. I struck a Vesta match, shielding the tiny flame within the hollow of my hands to throw a narrow beam of light over his shoulder. The damp earth before the threshold had been disturbed. A heel print, deep and uneven, indicated a man turning sharply on his right foot. I observed the impression closely, recognizing the distinct weight distribution of someone favouring an old injury to the left knee, a compensatory stride familiar to any military surgeon who has spent time in a convalescent ward. Holmes stood, acknowledging my observation with a single nod. He pushed the door. It swung inward with a protesting groan, revealing a void of suffocating darkness. I produced my bull's-eye lantern and cast its steady beam across the room. It was a space long abandoned by legitimate commerce, stripped of furniture save for a solitary wooden table and a crippled iron grate in the far wall. The air within was trapped, heavy with the scent of mildew and river mud, but beneath that aquatic dampness lay a sharper, much more recent odour. It was the distinct, bitter smell of scorched paper and sulphur. Holmes crossed the room in 3 long strides. I followed, sweeping the lantern beam into the corners, searching for the blackmailer we had hoped to corner. The room was utterly empty. There was no struggle, no discarded weapon, no sign of panic. The absence of our quarry was not a failure of our pursuit, but a calculated retreat. They had known we were coming. Holmes knelt before the rusted iron grate. Ash spilled from the shallow basin onto the rotted floorboards. It was a grey, flaky mound, still radiating a faint, residual heat that I could feel against the damp chill of my trousers. Someone had stood exactly where Holmes now knelt, hastily feeding evidence to the flames before slipping out into the London fog. I felt a surge of profound frustration. The trail we had tracked for 3 agonizing days had quite literally gone up in smoke. I said as much, lowering the lantern to illuminate the ruin of our expectations. Holmes did not answer immediately. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a pair of silver tweezers. With the delicacy of a master watchmaker, he began to separate the layers of ash. The fire had done its work efficiently on the loose papers, reducing them to weightless grey ghosts that disintegrated at the slightest exhalation. but at the very center of the grate lay a dense, blackened, rectangular mass. It was a ledger. The thick leather binding had resisted the initial flare, compressing the pages within and starving the fire of the oxygen required to consume them entirely. The edges were charred to brittle carbon, and the cover had blistered into a hardened, ugly shell, but the heart of the book remained intact. Holmes carefully slid his hands beneath the scorched volume, treating it with more reverence than a crown jewel, and lifted it from its ashen bed. He carried it to the solitary wooden table. I brought the lantern closer, adjusting the shutter to focus the light directly onto the ruined surface. Holmes used his tweezers and the flat edge of his pocket knife to gently pry open the fused cover. The sound was like the cracking of dried autumn leaves. I watched his hands intently. There was no tremor, no hesitation whatsoever. A heavy breath or a sudden clumsy movement would have reduced the fragile evidence to meaningless dust. The first few pages were entirely illegible, the ink having boiled away under the intense heat, leaving only the ghostly physical indentations of a steel nib on scorched paper. But as he worked his way toward the center of the binding, the damage lessened significantly. The paper transitioned from black to a deep roasted brown and finally to a stained, sickly yellow. Here, the ink had survived the inferno. It was an accounting. Neatly ruled columns of dates, sums, and corresponding initials filled the surviving pages. I leaned in, my medical eye catching the meticulous, almost mechanical nature of the handwriting. The strokes were upright, devoid of any emotional flourish or hesitation, executed by a hand long accustomed to rote administrative work. There was an absolute lack of the erratic spacing one might associate with a criminal mind operating under the pressure of a desperate flight. This was the ledger of a calm, methodical businessman. I read the visible dates aloud. They spanned the last 18 months, culminating in an entry dated merely 2 days prior. The sums recorded were staggering. Hundreds of pounds moving in a steady, bleeding flow from one party to another. Holmes traced the column of initials with the tip of his knife. He pointed to the recipient column. Every entry in this section was identical, marked only by the Greek letter Omega. This, we knew, was the alias of the blackmailer. Then he shifted his attention to the corresponding source column. Here the initials varied, representing the unfortunate souls trapped in Omega's sprawling web of extortion. I recognized 2 combinations immediately. A prominent member of Parliament whose sudden resignation the previous month had shocked the city, and a wealthy widow from Mayfair who had recently fled to the continent citing a severe nervous collapse. The blackmailer's reach was vast, a parasitic shadow draped over the highest echelons of London society. But Holmes was not interested in the names of the wealthy and ruined. His gaze was fixed on a recurring set of entries clustered near the bottom of the visible page. He breathed out, a sharp, quiet sound of profound realization that cut through the silence of the room. I followed his line of sight. The payments recorded in this cluster were not large sums of hush money. They were meagre, highly regular disbursements, shillings and pence paid out weekly rather than the devastating lump sums extorted from the elite. And the initials in the recipient column were not Omega. They were ordinary names and mundane designations: a baker in Marylebone, a carriage driver in Paddington, a domestic servant in Kensington. I stated my immediate conclusion. These must be the blackmailer's spies, the vast network of street informants and treacherous servants paid to gather the secrets of the wealthy. It seemed the only logical explanation. The ledger documented not only the grand income of extortion, but the mundane overhead costs of the criminal enterprise itself. Holmes shook his head slowly, his grey eyes reflecting the harsh, unforgiving light of the lantern. He instructed me to look at the very top of the page, where the header had miraculously survived the flames by virtue of being pressed tightly against the spine. I squinted against the glare, bringing my face closer to the fragile paper. The faded, looping script did not read as a ledger of illicit gains or the accounting of a shadow empire. It bore a single, highly respectable surname written out in the same meticulous hand. It was the name of our client. I felt a cold prickle of deep unease at the base of my neck, a sensation utterly disconnected from the damp air of the room. I asked Holmes to explain the meaning of this impossible contradiction. If this book belonged to the blackmailer, why would it carry the name of the very man who had hired us to stop the blackmail? The entries of shillings and pence were not payments to spies scattered across the city. They were ordinary, mundane household expenses: the butcher, the baker, the groom. The ledger before us was not a criminal's accounting book stolen from a hidden vault. It was a domestic ledger, the precise sort kept by a steward, an estate manager, or a chief housekeeper to manage the daily financial affairs of a large, wealthy estate. Holmes closed the surviving pages, leaving the charred book resting on the table like a desecrated grave. The implications settled over the damp room like a heavy shroud. The blackmailer had not merely targeted our client from afar, using anonymous letters and shadowed couriers. The enemy had unrestricted, daily access to the most private domestic records of the victim's household. The extortionist was using the household's own ledger to track the blood money, slipping illicit demands seamlessly between the grocery bills and the stable fees. The betrayal was not a matter of a stolen letter or a loose-lipped confidant in a gentleman's club. It was a cancer growing within the very walls of the sanctuary. Holmes turned away from the table, staring out the open door into the suffocating yellow mist. The fog seemed thicker now, a physical barrier pressing against the threshold of the counting house, sealing us in with the dreadful truth. He stated, in a voice devoid of all inflection, that our client had been searching for a wolf in the dark forest, completely blind to the fact that the beast was already sleeping comfortably by the hearth. He then looked back at me, his sharp features carved into hard angles by the shadows of the lantern light. If the master of the house did not write these entries, he asked, then whose hand held the pen that calmly recorded the destruction of their own master day by day under his very roof? Chapter 7. The Ashes of an Alibi. The acrid stench of hydrochloric acid and heating sulphur dominated the sitting room of our Baker Street quarters. I sat in my customary armchair with the morning paper resting on my knee, though I confess I had read nothing but the same paragraph for the past quarter of an hour. My attention was entirely captivated by the gaunt figure of my friend. Sherlock Holmes was hunched over his makeshift laboratory table, the blue flare of a Bunsen burner casting harsh skeletal shadows across his sharp features. His long, chemically stained fingers moved with the absolute precision of a surgeon as he transferred a clear liquid from a pipette into a boiling flask. His breathing was shallow and perfectly regulated. His eyes, fixed upon the bubbling glassware, possessed the frightening devotion of a fanatic at an altar. I have often observed as a medical man that extreme concentration exacts a physical toll on the human body, drawing the blood from the extremities and leaving the skin with a waxy pallor. Holmes, however, seemed to draw vitality from the fumes and the solitary focus of his work. He had not spoken a word since dawn. The case of the Riverbank murder had brought an oppressive atmosphere to our rooms. Arthur Thorne, a mild-mannered clerk of nervous disposition and unfortunate circumstances, sat in a holding cell at Scotland Yard. He had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he had been seen wearing a dark coat in the vicinity of the tragedy. Inspector Lestrade was entirely satisfied with the man. Holmes, entirely dissatisfied with the candle found near the body, had spent the night dissecting Thorne in absentia through the silent testimony of physical objects. Heavy footsteps sounded upon the stairs, followed by a sharp, authoritative rap at our door. Before I could rise to answer, the door swung inward to reveal Inspector Lestrade. He brought with him the damp chill of a London afternoon and the unmistakable odour of wet wool and stale tobacco. Rainwater beaded upon the brim of his bowler hat and dripped onto Mrs. Hudson's carpet. His face was flushed with the arrogant satisfaction of a man who believes his arduous work is at an end. He stood in the doorway, taking in the chemical apparatus and the noxious fumes with a pronounced wrinkling of his nose. He announced that he had come to collect Holmes's final report on the matter, though he made it clear he considered the request a mere formality. The magistrate was prepared to sign the warrant. Arthur Thorne would be charged with murder before the sun set. Holmes did not look up from his boiling flask. He held up a single long finger, commanding absolute silence. Lestrade opened his mouth to protest the indignity of being hushed, but my sharp glance deterred him. We waited in the suffocating quiet of the room, listening to the hiss of the blue flame and the steady, rhythmic tapping of the rain against the window panes. A thick, yellow precipitate began to form at the bottom of Holmes's flask. Only when the liquid above it turned perfectly clear did Holmes reach out and turn the brass valve of the burner, extinguishing the flame. He picked up a glass-stirring rod and turned to face the inspector. He stated with a cold, even tone that Lestrade was about to commit a monumental blunder. Lestrade stiffened, his professional pride stung. He listed the evidence with rapid defensive aggression. Thorne had threatened the deceased only 2 days prior. Thorne possessed no alibi for the hours between midnight and 2 in the morning, claiming only to have been walking the streets in a state of distress. Furthermore, Lestrade pointed out with triumphant emphasis, Thorne's boots had been found in his lodgings caked with wet mud. The mud placed him squarely on the riverbank where the body had been discovered. Holmes gestured with the glass rod toward a wooden tray resting on the edge of his work table. Upon it sat a pair of worn, cracked leather boots. They were indeed encrusted with a heavy layer of dried earth. Holmes asked me to examine them and deliver my medical opinion on their condition. I stepped forward and leaned over the tray. I noted the extreme wear on the soles, indicating a man who walked great distances out of financial necessity. I then looked closely at the mud clinging to the welts and the worn heels. The earth was highly textured, possessing a distinctly reddish hue and a crumbly, dry consistency. I voiced my observations, adding that the mud seemed entirely devoid of the organic decay one would expect from a tidal riverbank. Holmes offered a short, sharp nod of approval. He instructed Lestrade to recall the exact nature of the soil where the victim had fallen. The inspector, frowning in confusion, described the thick, black, clinging sludge of the Thames shoreline. It was a mire of rotting vegetation, coal dust, and industrial runoff. With a pair of brass tweezers, Holmes broke off a small clod of the reddish earth from Thorne's boot and dropped it onto a clean porcelain plate. He brought a magnifying lens over the sample and invited Lestrade to look. He pointed out the tiny, glittering fragments embedded within the red clay. He identified them as crushed particles of red brick, pulverized mortar, and a specific variety of chalky loam. He stated plainly that this composition of soil did not exist anywhere near the river. It existed in only one precise location in the whole of London. It was the byproduct of the deep excavations currently underway for the new underground railway lines near Kensington. The earth on those boots proved beyond all doubt that Arthur Thorne had been exactly where he claimed to be during the hours of the murder, miles away from the river, wandering in the vicinity of the railway works. Lestrade stubbornly crossed his arms over his damp overcoat. He suggested that Thorne could have walked by the river, committed the deed, and then walked to Kensington, picking up the new mud over the old. He suggested Thorne might have deliberately dirtied his boots in Kensington to create a false trail. Holmes did not raise his voice, but his eyes grew perfectly cold. He moved from the boots to the centre of his laboratory table. He stated that mud was only the beginning of the man's innocence. He directed our attention to a small brass dish containing a lump of misshapen, melted wax. It was the remains of the candle recovered from the scene of the crime. Beside it lay an intact, cheap tallow candle, which Lestrade had confiscated from Thorne's miserable lodgings as proof that the man possessed such illuminating tools. Holmes asked Lestrade to consider the nature of combustion. He explained that a common tallow candle, such as the one from Thorne's room, is made of rendered animal fat. It burns quickly, it produces a distinct foul odour of scorching meat, and it leaves behind a heavy, greasy soot. He struck a match and lit the wick of Thorne's candle to demonstrate. The flames sputtered, casting a weak yellow light, and immediately a thin trail of dark smoke rose toward the ceiling, carrying a profoundly unpleasant scent. Then Holmes extinguished the tallow flame and picked up a scraping knife. He scraped a few flakes from the melted lump of the crime scene candle into a clean test tube. He added a measure of distilled water and placed the tube over a low flame until the wax dissolved into a cloudy suspension. He then took a dropper bottle containing a dark chemical reagent and added 3 drops to the mixture. The reaction was instantaneous. The cloudy liquid flared into a brilliant, unnatural shade of violet. I leaned closer, fascinated by the violent colour. I recognized the chemical reaction from my university days in Edinburgh. I stated aloud that such a coloration indicated the presence of a specific metallic dye, likely a copper or cobalt derivative used in specialized manufacturing. Holmes praised my memory. He held the glowing violet tube up to the grey light of the window. He explained that the candle found near the body was not tallow, nor was it ordinary household paraffin. It was a highly refined, chemically treated Saracen wax, blended with a metallic salt. Such a composition was designed for a very specific purpose. It was engineered to burn with absolute steadiness, without a single trace of smoke, and without yielding to sudden draughts. He turned his piercing gaze upon the inspector. He asked Lestrade how a penniless clerk, a man who could barely afford the cheapest, foulest-smelling animal fat to light his own squalid room, could possibly obtain a scientifically refined, smokeless candle that cost more than his weekly wages. Thorn did not buy this candle. Thorn did not carry this candle. Thorn was never on that riverbank. The heavy silence returned to the room, broken only by the rain. Lestrade stared at the violet liquid in a glass tube. The arrogant certainty had drained entirely from his face, leaving behind the hollow, grey exhaustion of a man who has chased a phantom. He knew Holmes was right. The physical evidence was immovable. The arrest of Arthur Thorn was not merely a mistake, it was an impossibility. Lestrade gave a slow, reluctant nod. He muttered that he would return to the yard and arrange for the clerk's immediate release. Without another word, the inspector turned and walked heavily out of the room. We listened to his slow descent down the stairs and the distant, heavy slam of the street door. I let out a long breath and sank back into my armchair. I expressed my profound relief that an innocent man had been saved from the gallows. I remarked that the case had completely collapsed, and Scotland Yard was now forced to begin its search anew from the very beginning. Holmes did not reply. He stood motionless by the table, still holding the test tube. The violet liquid caught the meagre light from the window, casting a faint, bruised reflection across his sharp cheekbones. I asked him what troubled him, for his face was etched with a dark and sudden gravity. He slowly lowered the glass tube. He stated that the case had not collapsed, but rather it had merely revealed its true, monstrous face. He pointed to the lump of melted wax in the brass dish. He explained that a chemically treated, smokeless candle of that exact composition was not sold in standard shops. It had no domestic application. It was manufactured for one specialized trade alone. He looked toward the rain-swept window, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He told me that such wax was utilized exclusively by high-end continental undertakers. It was used to temporarily seal the eyes and the lips of a corpse during the embalming process to ensure a peaceful visage before rigor mortis could set in. The person who stood over the victim on that riverbank did not merely bring a light to see in the dark, they brought the tools of the mortuary. Chapter 8, The Reflection in the Window. The heavy oak doors of the study closed behind us, shutting out the murmurs of the constabulary in the corridor. The air within the room was stagnant, smelling faintly of cold ash, old paper, and the metallic tang of dried blood that still stained the Persian rug. The gas lamps had been turned down to a low hiss, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the faces of the three people gathered at the center of the room. I stood by the fireplace, keeping my hands clasped behind my back to prevent myself from shivering in the damp draught that seemed to seep from the very walls. Silas Thorn, the late man's nephew, sat slumped in a high-backed armchair. As a medical man, I could read the physical toll of the evening's interrogations upon him. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his collar was loose, and a fine but uncontrollable tremor afflicted his fingers where they gripped the armrests. His pulse, visibly beating at the side of his neck, must have been approaching 120. Beside him stood Elias Vance, the business partner. Vance presented a picture of rigid stoicism, his posture unnaturally stiff, though the sudden dilation of his pupils as Holmes approached indicated a state of suppressed terror rather than genuine calm. By the door hovered Mrs. Knorr. Gable, the housekeeper, clutching a woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders, her eyes darting between the men and the dark stain on the rug. Holmes stood by the heavy mahogany desk. He did not look at the suspects. His attention was entirely consumed by a small wooden box he had brought up from his own quarters. His profile was sharp against the dim light, his lips pressed into a thin line of absolute concentration. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight in the room. I watched Thorn swallow hard, preparing to speak, but Holmes raised a single, long finger to silence him before a word could be formed. "You are all here because you believe a ghost locked the door to this room," Holmes said. His voice was low, devoid of theatrics, yet it carried to every corner of the study. "You found the door secured from the inside. You broke the lock. You found a dead man alone. Therefore, you conclude the impossible." He opened the wooden box. I took a step forward, my curiosity overriding my desire to remain an impartial observer. From the velvet-lined interior, Holmes withdrew a candle. It was an ugly, squat thing, moulded from cheap yellow tallow, but its singularity lay in its construction. It possessed 2 wicks, spaced perhaps half an inch apart, protruding like the antennae of some pale insect. "A curious object, Watson," Holmes said, holding it up to the light. "Do you observe anything about the wax?" I leaned in closer. The smell of the tallow was harsh, lacking the sweet refinement of beeswax. The surface of the candle was scarred with uneven lumps, and nestled exactly between the two wicks was a tiny, jagged cleft, as though a hot needle had been driven into the wax and quickly withdrawn. "It is heavily adulterated," I replied. "A poor mixture. It would melt rapidly and unevenly. Furthermore, the two wicks are positioned in such a way that their heat would compound. The centre would liquefy far quicker than the outer edges." "Precisely." Holmes set the candle upon a silver saucer in the centre of the desk. A rudimentary but highly effective timer. "Mr. Vance, I believe you testified that you heard the key turn in the lock from the corridor entirely on its own, a full 10 minutes after your partner was last seen alive." Vance stiffened. "I heard what I heard, Mr. Holmes. There was no one in the room but the dead man. The key turned. The lock clicked. We all heard it." Holmes did not argue. He merely reached into his coat pocket and produced a small spool of black silk thread, the sort a tailor might use for a heavy winter coat. He unspooled a length of it, snapping it cleanly with his fingers. He then walked over to the door. The shattered remnants of the original lock had been cleared away, but the heavy brass key remained in the keyhole. "Watch closely," Holmes commanded. He tied one end of the black silk thread around the barrel of the brass key, securing it with a complex sailor's knot. He then drew the thread tight, bringing it down to the floor, looping it expertly under the heavy iron foot of an umbrella stand near the door. From there, he ran the thread along the dark oak skirting board, where its black colour rendered it entirely invisible against the wood. He brought the thread up the side of the mahogany desk, drawing it across the surface toward the silver saucer. I followed the line of the thread with my eyes, my mind assembling the mechanics of his demonstration before he had even finished. It was a pulley system, elegant in its malicious simplicity. Holmes retrieved a heavy lead paperweight from the desk drawer. He tied the paperweight to the slack end of the thread, letting the weight dangle precariously over the far edge of the desk. He then took the middle section of the taut thread and pressed it firmly into the small cleft I had observed between the two wicks of the candle. Mrs. Gable let out a ragged breath. "Sir, I do not understand what wickedness this is. It is the wickedness of physics, Mrs. Gable," Holmes replied softly. He struck a match. The sudden flare of sulphur made Thorne flinch in his chair. Holmes touched the flame to the first wick and then to the second. The twin flames sputtered for a moment before catching hold, rising in parallel streaks of yellow light. Holmes stepped back, gesturing for me to join him by the fireplace. The suspect stared at the candle as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "Now, we wait," Holmes said. "We wait exactly 10 minutes." The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the terrible soft hissing of the twin wicks consuming the cheap tallow. I watched the flames with clinical detachment, fascinated by the intersection of criminal intent and elemental science. The twin flames danced, casting a strange vibrating double shadow against the walls. Every object in the room, the heavy chairs, the tall bookcase, the slumped figure of Silas Thorne, now possessed two distinct silhouettes, overlapping and blurring at the edges. I took out my pocket watch. 5 minutes passed. The heat from the twin wicks was fierce. I could see the wax between them softening, pooling into a glossy liquid crater. The black silk thread, embedded just beneath the surface of that wax, was under immense tension from the dangling lead paperweight. 8 minutes passed. Thorne was weeping silently, his chin resting on his chest. Vance wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. The room was growing unnervingly warm. At exactly 9 minutes and 40 seconds, the wax between the wicks gave way. There was no explosion, no dramatic collapse. The liquid tallow merely yielded to the tension. The black silk thread slipped free of its waxen anchor. With a dull thud, the lead paperweight dropped from the edge of the desk to the carpeted floor. The thread snapped perfectly taut. I watched the sequence of events travel across the room with mechanical perfection. The thread pulled violently through the umbrella stand, transferring the kinetic energy upward to the door. The brass key turned. It rotated with a heavy metallic click that echoed off the high ceiling like a gunshot. The lock engaged. The door was secured. "My God!" Vance whispered, all his previous bravado collapsing into genuine awe. He locked it after he was gone. He locked it from the outside. Holmes walked to the desk and pinched out the twin flames. The room plunged back into the sickly gloom of the low gaslight. Yes, Holmes said. The murderer rigged the door, lit the candle, and calmly walked out of this room. 10 minutes later, the heat released the thread, the weight dropped, the key turned, and you were left with an impossible locked room. A brilliant contrivance. Thorne looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wild. Then we are free. You have proved it was someone else. Someone clever. We know nothing of threads and weights. I looked at Holmes, expecting him to deliver the final blow to one of the men in the room to reveal how he had found the silk thread upon their person. But Holmes was not looking at the suspect. He was not looking at the key. He was staring past the desk, out the tall dark window that overlooked the rain-slicked gardens. The glass, backed by the blackness of the night, acted as a perfect mirror for the interior of the study. Holmes walked slowly toward the glass, his face inches from the pane. I stepped to his side, trying to follow his line of sight. A brilliant contrivance, Holmes repeated, his voice barely a whisper. But every trick of light demands a witness. He reached out and tapped the cold glass of the window pane. Watson, you noted the double shadows cast by the twin flames. You saw how they painted the room in duplicates. I did, Holmes. The murderer designed this mechanism to provide an alibi, Holmes said, his eyes scanning the dark reflection of the room. He needed to be seen outside the house when the door locked. He needed the gardener to swear he saw a shadow moving across this window after the room was secured. But he could not be in two places at once, I said. No, Holmes replied softly, he could not. Holmes turned away from the window and looked at the three people in the room. His expression was not one of triumph, but of a grim and terrible realization. The mechanism worked perfectly, Holmes continued. The door locked. The killer was already gone. But I have just recreated the exact lighting conditions of that night. The heavy velvet curtains were open. The twin flames were burning on the desk. He stepped back, pointing a long arm toward the window pane. Look at the reflection, Watson. Look at the angle of the desk, the placement of the saucer, and the line of sight from the garden. I squinted at the dark glass. The reflection of the desk was clear, but the angle was severely distorted by the heavy beveling at the edge of the pane. If the killer was standing in the garden waiting to be seen by the gardener, I began, tracing the geometry in my mind, he would have been looking directly into this window. Holmes nodded slowly. And what would he have seen, Watson, reflected in the glass, illuminated by the blinding yellow glare of the twin flames? He would have seen the inside of the room, I answered. Holmes' eyes narrowed, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Yes. He would have seen the inside of the room. He would have seen his victim lying on the rug. But the man on the rug did not die from a sudden blow, Watson. As you yourself determined, the poison took at least 20 minutes to stop his heart. I felt a sudden, sickening jolt in my chest. I looked down at the dark stain on the carpet, then back to the window. Are you saying? I started, my voice catching in my throat. Holmes placed a hand flat against the cold window pane. The mechanism was not a delay to give the killer time to escape. It was a delay to give the killer time to watch. Holmes turned back to us, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and warp. The reflection in this glass tells a monstrous story. The killer stood in the dark, looking through this window, watching the twin flames burn. He watched the poison take effect. He watched his victim crawl across the floor in agony. And he waited until the man was entirely dead before allowing the wax to melt and the door to lock. The room was perfectly, horrifyingly silent. But that is not the most disturbing detail, Holmes whispered, kneeling down by the heavy wooden frame of the window. He ran his fingers along the brass latch at the bottom of the sash. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with a cold, pale fire. Watson, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a terrifying register. The latch is rusted shut from the inside. The dust is undisturbed. This window has not been opened in years. I stared at him, uncomprehending. If the window was sealed, I said, and the heavy curtains were drawn shut until we arrived this morning, how did the gardener see a shadow moving across the glass? Holmes stood up slowly, looking at the empty space beside the armchair. Because the shadow the gardener saw was not cast from the outside, Holmes replied. He looked toward the dark corridor. There was someone else in the room with the dead man, and they never left. Chapter 9. The Second Shadow. The air in our Baker Street sitting room was thick with the acrid bite of shag tobacco and the damp chill of a November evening pressing against the window panes. Rain lashed softly against the glass. a rhythmic tapping that seemed entirely out of phase with the heavy, uneven breathing of the man seated before our fireplace. Julian Thorne, half-brother to the late Arthur Pendleton, sat with his hands clutching the knees of his tailored worsted trousers. To the untrained eye, he appeared merely as a grieving relative, enduring the necessary formalities of a police inquiry. As a medical man, I saw a profound physiological collapse masquerading as composure. A fine sheen of cold sweat gathered at his hairline. His pallor had taken on the grey hue of old parchment, and the rapid pulse visible in his carotid artery betrayed a heart racing like a trapped bird. He was a man waiting for the trap door to open beneath his feet. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood near the door, his bowler hat revolving slowly in his hands. Lestrade wore an expression of mild impatience, clearly convinced that we were wasting our time with a man who possessed an airtight alibi. Holmes, however, was in no hurry. He stood by the mantelpiece, his gaunt frame draped in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, his long fingers carefully pressing a fresh charge of tobacco into the bowl of his clay pipe. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight in the room. Tension, I have long observed, is rarely born of action. It is born of the spaces between actions, the suspended moments before the inevitable strikes. "You arrived at your brother's house at 10:30, Holmes said at last. His voice was quiet, lacking its usual sharp resonance. "I did," Thorne replied, his voice tight. "As I have told the inspector. I arrived at 10:30, knocked upon the front door, and received no answer. I then walked to the end of the street, purchased an evening paper, and returned at 11. And it was at 11 that you saw the shadow against the Holland blind of your brother's study," Holmes continued. "Yes." Thorne swallowed hard. The street lamp illuminated the blind from the outside, but the candle on his desk cast his silhouette perfectly against the fabric. I saw his profile. I saw him raise a glass to his lips. Constable Davies saw it as well. Holmes struck a match. The sudden flare illuminated his sharp, aquiline features. He drew the flame into the pipe, exhaled a thick plume of blue smoke, and flicked the match into the grate. He did not look at Thorne. "You paint a masterful picture, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said. "A masterpiece of optical engineering and psychological manipulation. But you failed to account for the medical expertise of my colleague, Dr. Watson." Lestrade stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "See here, Mr. Holmes," Dr. Watson confirmed the time of death himself. "When we broke down the door at midnight, the doctor stated Pendleton had been dead for roughly 3 hours. I felt the sudden weight of the room's attention pivot toward me. I recalled the scene vividly. The heavy mahogany study, the smell of copper and spilled wine, and Arthur Pendleton slumped over his desk. I nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of Holmes's design. "The lividity of the blood settling in the dependent parts of the body," I said, keeping my tone measured and clinical. "The onset of rigor mortis in the jaw and neck muscles. The condition of the coagulated blood near the fatal wound at the base of the skull. Pendleton was entirely deceased by 9 o'clock, not 11. "Exactly so," Holmes said. He stepped away from the mantelpiece and approached the small, occasional table where he had laid out a series of items recovered from the crime scene. Therein lay the contradiction that has plagued Scotland Yard for 3 days. A man dead at 9 o'clock cannot drink a glass of wine at 11. The dead do not cast moving shadows, Mr. Thorne, unless, of course, the shadow never belonged to the man at all. I watched Thorne flinch. The movement was infinitesimal, a mere twitch of the left eyelid, but it was enough. Holmes picked up a small, charred lump of wax from the table. It was the remnant of the candle we had found burning low on Pendleton's desk. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, rotating it slowly. When we examined the study, the door was locked from the inside. The key was in the lock. The windows were fastened. A classic locked room, designed to suggest suicide or a phantom assailant. But my attention was drawn to the desk. Pendleton was a man of fastidious habits. He wrote his letters by the steady light of a brass reading lamp. Why, then, was there a thick tallow candle burning on the far edge of the desk, dangerously close to the Holland blind? Thorne offered no answer. His breathing had grown shallower. "The answer lies in the composition of the wax," Holmes stated. He tossed the lump to me. Catching it, I immediately noticed its strange density. I rubbed the surface with my thumb. It was greasy, yet unusually hard, lacking the soft, yielding texture of common paraffin or beeswax. "Notice the weight, Watson," Holmes instructed. "It feels metallic," I replied, bringing it closer to the gaslight, "and there is a faint scent of sulphur and camphor woven into the tallow." Holmes nodded briskly. "A custom mixture. Spermaceti wax blended with heavy tallow and a core of thin tin wire. When the wax melted, the wire remained upright. Attached to this wire was a small, expertly cut silhouette of tin foil folded flat within the upper layers of the candle. As the candle burned down over the course of 2 hours, the tin silhouette was exposed to the flame. The heat caused the tin to warp and unfold. Positioned precisely 2 inches from the Holland blind, the candlelight projected this unfolding shape onto the fabric. To the constable standing 50 yards away in the dark street, the warping tin looked exactly like a man leaning forward and raising a glass. Lestrade let out a low whistle, crossing the room to peer at the piece of wax in my hand. "A mechanical shadow," he muttered. "But what about the locked door? How did he get out, and how did he lock it from the inside?" Holmes turned his piercing grey eyes onto Thorne. The physical trick was brilliant. But the psychological trick was even more devious. It required the manipulation of the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. Thorne gripped his knees tighter. His knuckles were completely white. I observed a slight tremor vibrating through his forearms, the unmistakable symptom of adrenaline flooding a system that has no outlet for fight or flight. "You arrived at the house not at 10:30, but at 8, Holmes said. His sentences were now short, relentless strikes. "You argued with your brother. The subject was the family estate, heavily mortgaged to cover your gambling debts. He refused to pay. You struck him with a heavy brass paperweight. He fell. He died instantly." Thorne opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him. He produced only a dry, rasping sound. "You then set the scene," Holmes continued. "You positioned the body. You locked the door from the outside, using a duplicate key you had fashioned weeks ago. But a locked door is not enough. You needed a witness to believe Pendleton locked it himself from the inside. You walked down the hall and found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen. You told her your brother was in a foul temper and wished not to be disturbed under any circumstances. You then engaged her in conversation, ensuring she remained with you near the kitchen stairwell. I saw the architecture of the deception clearly now. The mind that had constructed this crime possessed a terrifying understanding of human assumption. While speaking to the housekeeper, Holmes said, 'You deliberately dropped your heavy walking stick upon the oak floorboards,' a loud, sharp crack echoing through the quiet house. You immediately apologized, looked toward the stairs, and remarked aloud that your brother had just slammed his study door in anger. Mrs. Gable, hearing the noise and primed by your earlier statement, accepted the premise completely. The sound of the falling stick became the sound of the slamming door in her memory. You then walked out the front door, leaving her to testify that Pendleton had locked himself in. And the key on the inside of the lock? I asked, genuinely curious as to how this final impossibility had been achieved. Holmes smiled without a trace of warmth. A masterful piece of misdirection. When Lestrade and his men arrived at midnight and broke down the door, splintering the frame, Thorne was standing right behind them. In the chaos of the forced entry, as the police rushed to the body, Thorne simply reached toward the splintered lock and produced the duplicate key from his own waistcoat, claiming it had fallen to the carpet from the inside. The police believed they had broken a locked room, simply because the perpetrator handed them the key and told them they had. Lestrade flushed a deep, mottled red. He realized instantly the magnitude of the professional embarrassment he had narrowly avoided. He stepped heavily toward the chair, withdrawing a pair of steel handcuffs from his coat pocket. Julian Thorne did not resist. The collapse was absolute. All the tension drained from his posture in a single rushing instant, leaving him slumped and hollowed. He held out his wrists, his eyes staring blankly into the dying embers of the fire. The metallic click of the handcuffs seemed abnormally loud in the quiet room. "I shall take him down to the yard," Lestrade said, his voice gruff to mask his chagrin. "You had my thanks, Mr. Holmes. We would have chased our own tails for a month on this one." "Take him away, Inspector," Holmes replied, turning his back to the room and staring into the fire. Lestrade hauled the silent Thorne to his feet and guided him out of the sitting room. I listened to their heavy footsteps descending the 17 steps to the street, followed by the opening and closing of the front door. The sound of the hansom cab rattling away over the wet cobblestones faded into the relentless drumming of the rain. I looked at Holmes. He had not moved from his position by the fireplace. His shoulders were rigid. The triumph of a closed case usually brought him a fleeting moment of manic energy, a spark of satisfaction before the inevitable dark descent into boredom. Tonight, there was no spark. There was only a profound, vibrating stillness. "A brilliant piece of deductive reasoning, Holmes," I said, pouring 2 glasses of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard. I stepped forward to hand him one, but stopped. Holmes was staring down into the grate, but his gaze was focused on a small, crumpled piece of paper he had extracted from the pocket of his dressing gown. It was a fragment of heavy vellum, burned along one edge. "You did not show that to Lestrade," I observed, keeping my voice low. Holmes slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was entirely devoid of light. "Thorne is a gambler, Watson, a desperate man driven by debts and anger. He is an opportunist, but he is not a chemist." I frowned, looking at the charred wax still resting on the table. "You mean the candle?" "Spermaceti, heavy tallow, and a metallic core designed to burn at a mathematically precise rate," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "That requires laboratory equipment. It requires an understanding of thermodynamics and optical geometry. Thorne could no more invent that candle than he could fly to the moon. He was given it. He was instructed on how to use it." I set the brandy glasses down. The clinking of the crystal sounded fragile in the heavy air. "Who gave it to him?" Holmes flattened the burned fragment of vellum against the mantelpiece. The handwriting upon it was small, precise, and entirely devoid of flourishes. It contained a mathematical formula detailing the exact ratio of wax to tin required to project a shadow across 50 yards of damp London night. "The web vibrates, Watson," Holmes murmured, his eyes locking onto the mathematical script. "Julian Thorne was merely a fly caught in the silk. But the spider who wove the trap, the spider who designed a candle to cast 2 shadows, he is still out there in the dark. And I fear he is now aware that we are pulling at his threads." Chapter 10. The Dying Flame. The heavy silence of the study was broken only by the erratic, shallow intake of breath from the man slumped in the leather armchair. Arthur Pendleton stared at the Persian rug beneath his boots, his hands trembling with the fine, rapid vibration characteristic of profound nervous shock. As a medical man, I observed the rapid, irregular pulsation at his carotid artery, estimating his heart rate to be dangerously accelerated. A cold, clammy diaphoresis beaded along his receding hairline, draining the blood from his usually ruddy complexion to leave a sickly, ashen grey. Beside him on the mahogany desk lay the instrument of his deception, a simple wax candle and a silver-backed vanity mirror, now entirely devoid of their sinister utility. The sharp, acrid scent of burnt wick and melting tallow lingered in the cold air of the room, mingling with the stale odour of fear. I stood by the door, my hand resting near the pocket of my ulster where my service revolver lay heavy and cold. Holmes remained by the window, his profile sharp against the wet pane, his expression utterly unreadable. "Lestrade will be here in exactly 12 minutes, Holmes said, his voice entirely devoid of triumph. "The inspector is not known for his subtlety, and the journey to Scotland Yard in a police wagon is entirely without comfort. You have this time, Pendleton. I suggest you use it to put your affairs in some semblance of order." The broken man raised his heavy head. His eyes were deeply bloodshot, the delicate capillaries ruptured by the immense physiological pressure of his prolonged deception. He looked not at Holmes, nor at me, but at the extinguished candle upon the desk. He asked for pen and paper, his voice a hoarse, fractured rasp that barely carried across the quiet room. He wished to write to his daughter, to offer whatever meagre explanation a father could provide to a child who would wake to find her family name utterly ruined. Holmes merely nodded toward the writing bureau. Pendleton dragged himself from the chair. His gait was unsteady, possessing the stiff, ruined posture of a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in the span of half an hour. I watched him dip the nib into the brass inkwell. The frantic, desperate scratching of metal against parchment became the solitary sound in the vast, shadowed house. The heavy tread of police boots upon the front stairs signalled the end of Pendleton's borrowed time. Inspector Lestrade entered the study flanked by 3 uniformed constables, his sharp, ferret-like face flushed with the damp chill of the London night and the eager satisfaction of a successfully concluded hunt. He took in the scene with a swift, practised eye, missing entirely the tragic nuances of the room, but grasping the essential, practical fact of the surrender. Lestrade moved forward, reciting the formal words of arrest with a practiced, rhythmic cadence. Pendleton offered no resistance whatsoever. He carefully folded his letter, sealed it with a single drop of wax from the very candle that had condemned him, and handed it silently to Holmes. The inspector placed his hand heavily upon the ruined man's shoulder and guided him toward the corridor. Within moments, the room was empty of its master, leaving behind only the cold draughts from the hallway and the lingering scent of sudden despair. The subsequent days brought the inevitable grinding machinery of justice to bear upon all those caught in the destructive wake of Pendleton's greed. Mrs. Nyam. Eleanor Carstairs, the widow whose inheritance had been the primary object of the murderous scheme, was summoned to the magistrate to have her rightful property restored. She received the news not with joy, but with the quiet, tearless resignation of a woman who had endured too much loss to find comfort in mere financial restitution. The young bank clerk, Mr. Prank, Avery, who had turned a blind eye to the altered ledgers in exchange for a modest elevation in his salary, managed to escape the gallows. He was, however, instantly dismissed from his profession, his reputation irreparably stained across the financial districts of the city. I saw him once a few days later, lingering near the embankment of the Thames, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind, his ink-stained fingers clutching a threadbare coat. He stood as a walking monument to the steep cost of silent complicity. Justice had been formally executed by the courts, yet it left no warmth in its wake. Our return to Baker Street occurred under a persistent, freezing drizzle. The iron-shod hooves of our horse struck a monotonous, ringing rhythm against the wet cobblestones, a hollow sound that echoed through the narrow, fog-choked avenues. When we finally ascended the 17 steps to our familiar rooms, the fire had burned low in the grate, leaving only a bed of glowing red embers. Mrs. Hudson, bless her reliable nature, had left a tray of cold meats and a fresh pot of tea upon the table. I took it upon myself to stoke the fire and pour the tea, recognizing the deep, brooding lethargy that had already begun to settle over my companion. The thrill of the chase had evaporated. The complex intellectual puzzle of the locked room and the alibi had been cleanly unravelled, and what remained was merely the sordid, predictable reality of human failing. Holmes threw himself into his velvet armchair, drawing his knees up toward his sharp chin and resting his long, thin fingers against his temples. He refused the tea with a slight shake of his head. Instead, he reached for his cherrywood pipe, packing it meticulously with the dark, strong shag tobacco he kept in the toe of a Persian slipper. The rhythmic striking of the match and the subsequent blue clouds of pungent smoke soon filled our small sitting room. For a long time, neither of us spoke a word. The steady ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional hiss of damp coal in the grate were the only intruders upon our shared silence. I sat opposite him, allowing the radiant heat of the fire to chase the damp chill from my bones, my mind continuously returning to the vivid image of Pendleton scratching out his final, desperate apology. "It is a singular thing," I observed at length, setting my porcelain teacup upon its saucer. A man of Pendleton's education, possessed of a comfortable home, a loving daughter, and the absolute respect of his peers. Yet he risked the entirety of his existence, and indeed his very life, for an accumulation of wealth he did not strictly need. The human mind is remarkably fragile when exposed to the peculiar magnetism of unearned gold. Holmes exhaled a thick, unbroken stream of smoke, watching it curl and dissipate toward the plastered ceiling. "Need is an entirely subjective condition, Watson," he said, his voice quiet and perfectly steady. Pendleton did not need the money to survive, he needed it to sustain a carefully constructed illusion. Greed is rarely about the mere acquisition of coins or property. It is about the acquisition of power, the reinforcement of a fragile ego, the desperate desire to construct an impenetrable fortress against the unpredictable whims of the world. It is a slow poison, taken drop by drop, until the moral faculties are entirely calcified. I considered his words, struck as I often was by their cold precision. "It is fitting, then," I replied, "that he employed such a specific and calculated device to mask his crime." A single candle placed carefully before a silver backing mirror, positioned at the precise geometric angle to throw two distinct shadows upon the window blind. One shadow to establish an absolute alibi before the eyes of the street, moving and flickering with the draught. The other cast in secret, providing the illumination he required while he committed murder in the dark. It required a dispassionate intellect. It is the very essence of human duality. Precisely, Holmes murmured, his eyes half closed beneath heavy lids. The two shadows. One represents the man society wishes to see, the upright citizen, the devoted father, the reliable friend of the community. The other is the monstrous hidden silhouette of the man's true nature, elongated and brutally distorted by his own private desires. We all cast two shadows, Watson. The tragedy of Arthur Pendleton was simply his arrogant belief that he could manipulate and control both. He forgot the fundamental law of his own trick. A shadow is irrevocably bound to the flame that creates it. When the flame is finally extinguished, the shadows do not separate and survive on their own. They vanish together into the absolute blackness. Holmes reached slowly for his violin, resting the polished wood beneath his chin, though he did not immediately draw the bow across the strings. His sharp gaze was fixed intently upon the dying embers in the hearth. The instrument was his customary refuge from the ugliness of the world, a mathematical purity of sound that offered a clean antidote to the chaotic, irrational impulses of criminal minds. I knew better than to press the philosophical conversation any further. The case was officially concluded. The rigorous intellectual exercise was over, and Inspector Lestrade would soon take the lion's share of the credit in the morning editions of the daily papers. Holmes would allow the Yard their public triumph, preferring the solitary satisfaction of his own genius and the melancholy peace of his music. It is late now. Holmes retired to his bedroom over an hour ago, the melancholic, weeping strains of a German sonata having eventually faded into the deep, settling silence of the house. I sit alone at my writing desk, my medical journals pushed carelessly aside in favour of the blank parchment upon which I record these factual accounts. Outside, the great sleeping beast of London breathes through its foggy streets, harbouring a million hidden secrets, a million dualities, a million quiet desperations waiting for the spark to ignite. I have documented the rigorous facts of the investigation, the brilliant deductions of the ash and the wax, the psychological trap meticulously laid by my friend. Yet the moral weight of the affair refuses to neatly align itself into a satisfying conclusion. I cannot banish the memory of Pendleton's trembling, guilt-stained hands, nor the profound sorrow of the widow who received her stolen gold, but forever lost her faith in the fundamental decency of mankind. The brass gas lamp on my desk sputters, casting erratic, dancing shapes against the flocked wallpaper of our sitting room. I reach out and turn the valve, plunging my immediate surroundings into darkness, save for the faint orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. I have lit a single, small wax taper to heat the sealing wax for the final page of my manuscript. As the hot red drop falls heavily upon the paper, I lean forward and blow out the flame. A thin grey wisp of smoke rises into the cold air, twisting violently for a moment before disappearing entirely into the unseen draughts of the room, leaving behind nothing but the sharp, bitter scent of an extinguished light.